I could barely walk when I stepped off the Army shuttle. By sunset, my husband had called me a burden. My mother-in-law had thrown me and my 10-year-old daughter out of their house, and I was driving through a Kentucky thunderstorm, wondering how my entire life had fallen apart in less than 12 hours. My name is Claire Dawson. I'm 46 years old and I spent 22 years serving in the U.S. Army as a logistics officer. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't special. I simply believed that when your country asked you to do a job, you did it the best you could. My last deployment was in Kuwait. 3 months before I came home, a military transport truck slid off a flooded road during a supply mission. We survived, but my left leg didn't come out the same. The doctors repaired what they could, but nerve damage isn't something you just shake off. The Army told me I'd probably always have a limp. I figured I could live with that. I never imagined my own family couldn't. Brian barely looked up from his phone when I walked through the front door of our house in Lexington. "You're home?" he said. No hug. No smile. Just those 2 words. Emma came running before I could even set down my duffel bag. "Mom!" She wrapped her arms around my waist carefully, as if she'd already been warned not to squeeze too hard. I kissed the top of her head. "I missed you more than you know. I made you a welcome home sign," she whispered. She pointed toward the dining room where colorful construction paper hung crookedly across the wall. "Welcome home, Mom." Some of the letters were backwards. It was the most beautiful thing I'd seen in over a year. Linda Dawson was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee like she owned the place. Technically, she didn't. Emotionally, she acted like she did. She looked me up and down. "So, this is how you came back?" I forced a smile. "The doctors say I'll keep improving." She shrugged. "I guess we'll see." That evening felt strangely quiet. Brian hardly spoke during dinner. Emma kept trying to fill the silence by talking about school, her soccer team, and the stray cat she'd been feeding behind the garage. Every time she laughed, Brian seemed irritated. After Emma went upstairs to shower, Brian finally spoke. "We need to be honest with each other." I knew that tone. I'd heard soldiers use it before delivering bad news. "What is it?" He rubbed his forehead. "I didn't expect things to be like this." I looked down at my leg. "You mean because I'm limping?" "I mean everything." He stood and walked to the window. "I've been thinking for months." My stomach tightened. "I don't think I can do this anymore." "Do what?" "This marriage." The room suddenly felt much smaller. "I spent a year wondering if I'd make it home," I said quietly. "And I spent a year realizing I don't want to spend the rest of my life taking care of someone." I stared at him. "I don't need someone to take care of me." "You say that now." Before I could answer, Linda walked into the room carrying my suitcase. She set it beside the front door, not gently. "I'm sorry, Claire," she said, although she didn't sound sorry at all. "Brian deserves a chance to be happy." I looked from her to my husband. Neither of them looked away. Emma came downstairs just then. She froze. "Mom," Brian wouldn't even look at his daughter. I knelt as carefully as I could and held her close. "We're going for a little drive." "In the rain?" "Yeah." She nodded without asking another question. Children always know more than adults think they do. 20 minutes later, the windshield wipers struggled against sheets of rain as we left Lexington behind. I had no destination in mind except one place I hadn't seen in nearly 20 years. My childhood home. The old farmhouse my father had left behind. I had always planned to sell it one day. I had no idea that by sunrise that house would change everything I believed about my past and my future. The rain never let up. It pounded against my old Ford Explorer so hard that the headlights barely cut through the darkness. Interstate 64 was almost empty except for the occasional semi-truck throwing sheets of water across my windshield. Emma had fallen asleep about an hour outside Lexington. She still wore her little pink backpack on her shoulders. She must have grabbed it before we left. I glanced over and smiled despite everything. Kids have a way of packing the things that matter most. Her backpack held a stuffed rabbit she'd owned since kindergarten, a chapter book she was halfway through, and if I knew my daughter, at least 3 snack bars she had hidden from her father. I wished life could stay that simple. The farther east I drove, the more familiar everything became. Old gas stations, small churches with white steeples, feed stores, country roads I hadn't traveled since my 20s. I hadn't planned to come back here. After Dad passed away almost 18 years earlier, I couldn't bear looking at the farmhouse. Every room reminded me of him. Every fence post had a memory attached to it. So I'd locked the doors, paid the property taxes every year, and told myself I'd deal with it someday. Apparently, someday had arrived. Around 1:30 in the morning, I turned onto Miller Creek Road. The narrow blacktop gave way to gravel. The tires crunched beneath the truck. Even in the rain, I recognized every bend. There was the old grain silo that had leaned to one side for as long as I could remember. The abandoned red barn where my friends and I used to play hide and seek. The tiny cemetery where my grandparents rested beneath matching limestone markers. When I finally saw the farmhouse, my chest tightened. The porch light was on. I frowned. That didn't make any sense. No one had lived there for years. I parked beneath the giant maple tree Dad had planted when I was in middle school. The rain softened to a steady drizzle. Before I could even open the driver's door, I saw someone step onto the porch. He moved slowly, leaning on a cane. Even from a distance, I recognized him. "Walter," he smiled. "I was wondering how long it'd take you." Walter Jenkins looked older than I remembered. He had to be in his 80s now. His white hair had thinned, and his shoulders curved forward, but his smile hadn't changed one bit. I stepped out carefully. My leg protested immediately. Walter noticed. "So, it finally caught up with you." I laughed softly. "I guess it did." He looked toward Emma sleeping inside the SUV. "That's your little girl." "Emma. She's beautiful." He reached into the pocket of his old canvas jacket. "I've been waiting a long time to give you something." He pulled out a large manila envelope. It looked ancient. The edges were worn soft. Dust clung to the corners despite the plastic sleeve protecting it. Across the front, written in neat block letters, were just 4 words. "For Claire, when she comes home." My heart skipped. I knew that handwriting. "Dad," Walter nodded. He left it with me. My throat tightened. "When?" "The week before he passed." I stared at him. He knew I was coming tonight." Walter shook his head. "No." "Then why?" "He didn't know when." Walter looked toward the farmhouse. "He only said that one day life would bring you back here." The rain dripped steadily from the porch roof. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind. "Why didn't you mail it?" Walter smiled sadly. "Because Frank made me promise. He said if I mailed it, you'd read it." Walter looked me straight in the eyes. "But if I handed it to you here," he glanced at the old farmhouse, "you'd understand it." I looked at the house. Its white paint had faded. The porch swing Dad built still hung where he'd left it. The wind chime Mom bought before she died still moved gently in the breeze. For the first time since leaving Lexington, I felt something other than heartbreak. I felt curiosity. Walter reached over and rested one weathered hand on my shoulder. "Get Emma inside. You both need a warm meal. Then," he said quietly, "you can find out why your father spent the last year of his life writing almost every single day." I looked down at the envelope again. It suddenly felt much heavier than paper should. Walter insisted that Emma and I come inside before opening the envelope. "The furnace still works," he said. "Not pretty, but it works." The farmhouse smelled exactly the way I remembered. Old pine floors. Fresh coffee. A hint of cedar from the closet by the front door. The furniture hadn't changed much either. Dad's recliner still faced the stone fireplace. His reading glasses rested on the small table beside it, as if he'd only stepped outside for a few minutes. For a second, I forgot he had been gone for 18 years. Emma wandered quietly through the living room. "Mom?" "Yeah, sweetheart." "Did Grandpa live here all by himself?" "He did." She ran her fingers across the old piano. "I wish I'd met him." "So do I." Walter disappeared into the kitchen and returned a few minutes later carrying bowls of homemade chicken soup. "Eat first," he said. "Some things are easier to hear on a full stomach." Neither Emma nor I argued. By the time we finished eating, the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle outside the kitchen window. Walter pushed the envelope across the table. "I think it's time." My hands hesitated before touching it. The paper felt brittle with age. I carefully slid a folded letter from inside. There were only 2 pages. At the top, in my father's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 simple words. "My dear Claire, if you're reading this..." I stopped breathing for a moment. Walter quietly looked out the window, giving me privacy. I unfolded the 2nd page. "If life has brought you back to this house, then something has gone terribly wrong." A tear rolled down my cheek before I realized I was crying. "Dad knew me too well," he continued. "You always believed people deserved another chance. I admired that about you. But there is one man I never fully trusted." I already knew who he meant before I read the name. "Brian." I looked up at Walter. "You knew," he nodded slowly. "Your father talked to me." I looked back down. "A year before your wedding, Brian came here while you were away at training." I frowned. Brian had never mentioned that. He asked questions no young man in love should ask. He wanted to know who owned this farm. He wanted to know how much land came with it. He asked about my savings, my life insurance, and whether everything would belong to you one day. I felt sick. Dad had written every question down, word for word. The date sat neatly in the corner of the page. Nearly 20 years ago, long before Brian proposed, long before Emma was born, long before I ever suspected anything. The next paragraph was harder to read. I prayed I was wrong. I hoped he was simply immature. People grow, they change. For your sake, I wanted to believe he would. I closed my eyes. Dad had never once spoken badly about Brian. Not once. Even when I thought they simply didn't have much in common. He had carried this concern alone. The letter continued. If you're reading this, then my fears were probably justified. Please don't waste your energy wondering whether you somehow caused it. Some people only love what they believe they can gain. When there's nothing left to take, they leave. Emma reached over and quietly took my hand. Mom, I'm okay. It wasn't true, but I needed her to believe it. At the bottom of the page, Dad had written something unexpected. There's something else you need to know. I didn't leave this farm unprotected. My eyes moved faster. Several months after Brian's visit, I hired attorney Harold Benson in Winchester. He created a trust in your name. The farmhouse, the surrounding acreage, the mineral rights, every investment account, they're all protected. I stared at the words. What trust? Walter smiled gently. You really didn't know? I slowly shook my head. Dad had never mentioned any of it. Walter reached for another box sitting beside the fireplace. It was old, wooden. Its brass hinges had turned green with age. He carried it to the table and carefully lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of black notebooks, everyone labeled by year. Frank Miller journals. Walter looked at me quietly. Claire, your father wrote almost every day. I looked at the stack. There had to be 20 years of his thoughts sitting inside that box. And somehow I knew the letter had only scratched the surface. I didn't sleep that night. Emma curled up on the old couch beneath one of my mother's handmade quilts and fell asleep almost immediately. Children have an amazing ability to find peace in places adults carry painful memories. I envied her. The farmhouse was quiet except for the ticking grandfather clock in the hallway. Every hour it chimed, reminding me how much of my life had slipped away without me seeing what had been right in front of me. Walter had gone home just after midnight. Before leaving, he rested his hand on the wooden box of journals. Don't rush through them, he said. Your father wasn't writing history. He was writing to you. Around 2 in the morning, I carried the first notebook into the kitchen. The cover read, 2005, the year before Brian and I got married. I made myself a cup of coffee even though I knew sleep wasn't coming anyway. Dad's handwriting filled every page. Some entries were ordinary. Changed the oil in the tractor today. Fence needs fixing before winter. Claire called from Texas. Sounds happy. Reading those simple thoughts made me smile. Then I reached an entry dated October 17th. Dad had underlined the date. Brian stopped by today. My stomach tightened. He asked whether Claire had told me about their future plans. I said she'd mentioned marriage. He smiled, but his eyes stayed on the paperwork spread across my kitchen table. I turned the page. Then he asked questions that didn't sit right with me. Dad listed them one after another. How much land comes with the farm? Will Claire inherit everything? Are there any debts? Has the oil company ever approached you about mineral rights? I frowned. Mineral rights? I had no idea our property even had any. Dad continued. I answered politely but carefully. He never once asked how Claire was doing. Not once. I closed the journal for a moment. I could almost hear Brian's voice asking those questions. At the time, I would have defended him. I would have said he was just trying to plan for the future. Now, I wasn't so sure. I opened the next journal. The entries became more personal. Dad never called Brian a bad man. That wasn't his way. Instead, he simply described what he saw. Brian borrowed $3,000 today. Said he was behind on credit cards. A month later, another loan? Then, $5,000 this time. I stared at the page. Brian had always told me he was doing well financially. He handled our bills, our savings, our retirement account. I trusted him completely. Dad's journals painted a different picture. One entry hit harder than all the others. Brian asked me not to tell Claire. He said she worries too much. I don't believe that's the reason. Another page. Another loan. Another promise to pay Dad back. Then another. The amounts grew larger. Some were marked as repaid. Most weren't. I leaned back in my chair. My father had quietly protected Brian's pride for years. Not because Brian deserved it. Because Dad didn't want me carrying unnecessary stress while I was balancing military life, marriage, and motherhood. My eyes burned. How many sacrifices had that man made without telling me? Near dawn, I reached an entry written only 6 months before Dad died. It was much shorter. Claire called tonight. She sounds happy. Brian still smiles when she's around. I hope that smile is real. Then came one final sentence. If she ever comes back to this house alone, I'll know I was right to prepare. I couldn't read another word. I closed the journal and pressed both hands against my face. For years I'd believed my marriage fell apart because I came home injured. Because I couldn't run anymore. Because I limped. But sitting there in my father's kitchen, surrounded by notebooks he never expected anyone else to read another truth, slowly settled over me. Brian hadn't left because I was wounded. He left because in his eyes I had stopped being useful. My injury hadn't changed who he was. It had only exposed him. As the first light of morning crept through the kitchen window, Emma walked in, rubbing her eyes. She looked at me then at the stack of journals. Did Grandpa write all those? I nodded. He sure did. She climbed onto my lap like she used to when she was little. What did you learn? I wrapped my arms around her and looked toward the sunrise beyond the fields. I learned that Grandpa spent years protecting us. I paused. And I think it's finally my turn to finish what he started. The first week was nothing like the movies. Nobody showed up with a miracle. Nobody handed me a check. Nobody fixed my problems overnight. Most mornings I woke up before 6 because my legs stiffened if I stayed in bed too long. The army doctors had warned me that mornings would probably be the hardest. They weren't wrong. I'd sit on the edge of the old bed in my father's room, rubbing my knee until I could stand without gritting my teeth. Emma noticed everything. She never complained. One morning she quietly carried my boots into the kitchen before I even asked. I thought it'd save you a trip back upstairs. I smiled. When did you get so thoughtful? She shrugged. I've been watching you. That answer stayed with me all day. Children don't listen as much as they watch. I didn't want my daughter growing up believing life was something that happened to you. I wanted her to see that sometimes you had to rebuild it yourself. The farmhouse needed almost everything. The roof leaked over the back bedroom. Half the porch railing had rotted away. The water heater made a loud banging noise every time someone turned on the shower. The barn leaned just enough to make me nervous whenever the wind picked up. I stood on the porch one afternoon with a yellow legal pad making a list. Roof. Plumbing. Electrical inspection. Windows. Paint. Every item had a price beside it. Every price reminded me that Brian had emptied our joint checking account 2 days before I came home. The bank manager in Lexington had confirmed it. He was an authorized account holder, Mrs. Dawson. Legally, there wasn't much they could do. I drove home furious. Not because of the money, because I'd trusted him. That hurt more. A few days later, I met with Harold Benson, the attorney Dad had mentioned. His office sat on Main Street in Winchester above an old pharmacy that still had a soda fountain. Harold had to be in his 70s. He wore suspenders, polished loafers, and reading glasses that constantly slid down his nose. He smiled the moment I introduced myself. I've been expecting you. I laughed softly. That's becoming a theme around here. He chuckled. Your father planned further ahead than most people I've ever known. For nearly 2 hours he explained the trust. Dad hadn't been wealthy by Lexington standards, but he had been careful. He'd invested steadily, never borrowed money, never chased risky opportunities. The farm, 38 acres, mineral rights, a modest investment portfolio, life insurance he had never touched after Mom died. Together it was worth far more than I'd imagined. I sat there speechless. I had no idea. Harold nodded. He wanted it that way. Why? Because he believed inheritance changes people. I thought about Brian. Maybe Dad had been right. Harold slid another folder across his desk. There is one thing you should know. I opened it. Inside were copies of several legal documents. One signature immediately caught my eye. Brian's. He signed these about 15 years ago. I looked at Harold. I don't understand. When your father refinanced a small section of the property, Brian signed a legal acknowledgement stating he understood this estate belonged solely to you. I blinked. He knew. He absolutely knew. I leaned back in the chair. So Brian hadn't just guessed I might inherit someday. He had known for years, and he had still looked me in the eyes after every deployment, pretending money didn't matter. When I walked outside, the afternoon sun felt warmer than it had in weeks. For the first time since coming home, I realized something important. Brian had taken my house, my marriage, my savings, my confidence. But thanks to my father, he hadn't taken my future. That evening, Walter found me sitting on the porch with a hammer in one hand and a loose porch board at my feet. "You planning on fixing that yourself?" "I can try." Walter grinned. "Claire, I've known you since you were 8. You inherited Frank's stubbornness." "I did." He laughed. "Good." "You're gonna need every bit of it." I smiled for the first time in days. Somehow, hearing that from an old family friend felt better than any speech about staying strong. Tomorrow I'd start repairing the porch, one board at a time. Just like I'd start repairing my life, one day at a time. By the second week, the porch was finished. It wasn't perfect. One board sat just a little higher than the others, and the white paint didn't quite match the older railing. But every time I stepped outside with my morning coffee, I looked at it with a quiet sense of pride. I'd built it, or at least rebuilt it. That felt like a good metaphor for my life. Every morning followed the same routine. I'd stretch my leg before sunrise, make breakfast for Emma, drive her to Miller Creek Elementary, then come back to the farmhouse with a list of repairs waiting for me. Some days my leg cooperated. Other days it reminded me exactly why I'd been medically retired. I hated asking for help. The Army teaches you to solve problems, not become one. Walter seemed to understand that before I did. One Saturday morning I heard pickup trucks pulling into the driveway, then another, and another. By the time I stepped onto the porch, 6 trucks were parked beside the barn. Men and women climbed out carrying toolboxes, ladders, buckets, and enough lumber to rebuild half the county. I looked at Walter. "What is all this?" He grinned. "I made a few phone calls." One of the men walked toward me with an easy smile. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a faded Marine Corps cap. "I'm Mike Reynolds." He shook my hand carefully. "Walter tells me you're Army." "I was," he laughed. "Once Army, always Army." Before I could respond, a woman carrying a box of paintbrushes walked up beside him. "I'm Susan. My husband served with the 101st years ago." She pointed toward the house. "That roof isn't going to fix itself." Within 30 minutes, the property looked like a construction site. Someone climbed onto the roof. Someone else repaired loose shutters. Another volunteer replaced broken fence posts. Nobody asked for money. Nobody expected anything. They simply showed up. I stood there feeling almost uncomfortable. "I can't let you all do this." Mike looked at me as though I'd said something ridiculous. "You already did your part. I just drove trucks and managed supplies." He smiled. "And those supplies kept people alive." There wasn't much I could say after that. Around lunchtime, Walter carried a folding table into the yard. Soon it was covered with sandwiches, potato salad, lemonade, and homemade pies. Mrs. Carter, who lived down the road, handed Emma 2 chocolate chip cookies. "I hear you're helping your mom." Emma smiled proudly. "I've been sorting Grandpa's tools." Mrs. Carter winked. "Sounds like you're the foreman." Emma giggled. It was the first carefree laugh I'd heard from her since we left Lexington. That alone made the entire day worth it. As everyone ate together beneath the maple tree, I realized something that caught me off guard. These people barely knew me anymore. Some hadn't seen me since high school, yet they had come without being asked. Meanwhile, the people I'd lived with for nearly 20 years had turned their backs on me. Life has a strange way of showing you who your family really is. Later that afternoon, Harold Benson pulled into the driveway. He climbed out carrying a thick folder. "I thought you'd want to see this." We sat on the porch while the others continued working. Harold opened the folder. "I reviewed every document your father left." He adjusted his glasses. "Claire, there's another layer to this." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Frank wasn't just protecting the property. He was protecting you from exactly the situation you're facing now." He slid a document toward me. Across the bottom was Brian's signature. "Again, this is a post-nuptial waiver your father requested years ago." "I've never seen it." "You weren't supposed to." Harold nodded toward the signature. "Brian acknowledged in writing that neither he nor his future heirs would ever have any claim to your father's estate." I stared at the paper. "So if Brian decides to fight me?" Harold smiled. "He can try." Then his expression turned serious. "But he'll lose." For the first time since I'd driven away from Lexington in the middle of that storm, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Safe. Not because of the money. Not because of the farm. Because my father had loved me enough to think 10 steps ahead. That evening, after everyone left, Emma and I stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the fields gold. She slipped her hand into mine. "Mom." "Yeah, I think Grandpa knew we'd come home." I looked across the quiet fields where my father had spent most of his life. Maybe he hadn't known when, but somehow he had made sure we'd never have to face it alone. About a month after Emma and I moved into the farmhouse, life finally settled into something that resembled a routine. Emma loved her new school. The principal, Mrs. Harper, had introduced her to another girl named Lily on the very first day, and the two of them quickly became inseparable. Every afternoon they rode their bikes down Miller Creek Road until the porch light came on. Seeing Emma laugh again made every sore muscle worth it. As for me, I spent my mornings repairing the farmhouse and my afternoons helping Mike Reynolds with inventory at his hardware store in town. It wasn't glamorous work, but after years of Army schedules and paperwork, there was something comforting about helping customers find the right screws or loading bags of mulch into pickup trucks. People knew my name. They asked about Emma. They asked how my leg was healing. Not one person made me feel like a burden. One Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. I had just returned from town when I noticed a black BMW parked in front of the farmhouse. My stomach tightened immediately. Brian! He stood beside the driver's door wearing pressed jeans and the blue button-down shirt I had bought him for our 15th anniversary. For a brief second, it almost felt like the last month had never happened. Then I remembered the suitcase. The rain. Emma standing on the porch crying. Brian smiled nervously. Claire. I didn't smile back. What are you doing here? I was hoping we could talk. He glanced toward the house. I brought something for Emma. He opened the back seat and pulled out 2 gift bags, a new bicycle helmet, several books, a stuffed golden retriever almost as big as Emma, the kind of presents that usually come wrapped in guilt. Emma stepped onto the porch behind me. Dad, Brian's face softened. Hey, Peanut. She didn't run to him. She stayed beside me. That told me more than words ever could. Brian cleared his throat. I've made a lot of mistakes. I folded my arms. That's one way to put it. I was overwhelmed. I panicked. My mom kept telling me that. He stopped himself. No. I'm not blaming her. I made my own decisions. That was the first honest thing I'd heard him say in weeks. I've been seeing a counselor. I've had a lot of time to think. I miss my family. I wanted to believe him. 20 years together doesn't disappear overnight. I remembered birthdays, camping trips, Emma learning to ride her bike, the nights we'd stayed awake talking about retirement. Part of me wanted those memories to mean something. Brian took one careful step closer. I know I don't deserve another chance, but maybe someday. Before he could finish, another car pulled into the driveway. Linda climbed out before the engine even stopped. She walked toward us wearing sunglasses far too expensive for a visit to an old farmhouse. Her smile looked rehearsed. Oh, Claire, I've missed you. I almost laughed. A month ago, she had left my suitcase on the porch. Now she was acting like we'd simply had a misunderstanding. She reached toward Emma, my sweet granddaughter. Emma quietly stepped behind me. Linda's smile flickered. I know we all said things we regret. We're family. Families forgive. Walter happened to be walking across the neighboring pasture carrying a bucket of feed. He looked toward the driveway but wisely kept walking. He knew this wasn't his conversation. Brian looked at me again. We can fix this. We'll sell the farmhouse. Come back home. We'll start over. I stared at him. Not long ago, hearing those words would have broken my heart. Now, something felt different. Before I could answer, Emma tugged gently on my sleeve. Mom, yes, sweetheart. She looked straight at Brian, then at Linda. Her voice was quiet, but every word landed like a stone. If you loved us. She hesitated. Why did you leave us in the rain? Nobody spoke. Brian looked down at the gravel. Linda opened her mouth but couldn't seem to find an answer. Emma wasn't angry. She was genuinely confused. Children have a way of asking the questions adults spend years trying to avoid. In that moment, I realized I had been searching for the perfect response all afternoon. My daughter had already given it. I looked at Brian calmly. I hope counseling helps you. I truly do. But some doors don't reopen after you close them. Brian nodded slowly. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked like a man who finally understood what he had lost. As they drove away, I noticed Linda arguing with him through the windshield. I thought it was over. I couldn't have been more wrong. 3 days later, Harold Benson called. His voice was unusually serious. Claire, Brian just filed a lawsuit. I sat in Harold Benson's office the following morning with a knot in my stomach that felt worse than anything I'd experienced during deployment. Harold laid the lawsuit on his desk and adjusted his glasses. I wanted you to read it yourself. I skimmed the first page. Brian Dawson claimed that I had manipulated my late father into changing his estate plan. According to the complaint, Frank Miller had supposedly been confused in his later years and unduly influenced by me. I couldn't believe what I was reading. My father died 18 years ago. I know. And I was deployed overseas when most of these documents were signed. I know. I looked at Harold. So how can he even file something like this? Harold folded his hands. Anyone can file a lawsuit. Winning one is a different matter. He leaned back in his chair. My guess, he isn't expecting to win. What does he want? Harold gave me a tired smile. To pressure you. To scare you. To make you settle. I laughed once. Not because it was funny. Because it was unbelievable. He threw me out. He emptied our bank account. And now he wants my father's farm. Harold nodded. Greed rarely knows when to stop. Word spread through the county faster than I expected. By Friday, people at the hardware store were quietly asking Mike if everything was all right. At Miller Creek Diner, 2 older women stopped me on my way to the register. We're praying for you, one of them said. That surprised me. Small towns have long memories, but they also have a way of recognizing who shows up honestly. Brian, on the other hand, had barely visited the town in 20 years. The hearing was scheduled for the following month at the Clark County Courthouse in Winchester. On the morning of the hearing, I wore the same navy blue suit I'd worn for my military retirement ceremony. My medals stayed in the closet. This wasn't about my service. This was about my father. Emma hugged me before school. You'll be okay. I smiled. I hope so. Walter drove with me. Neither of us talked much during the drive. Sometimes silence is exactly what you need. The courtroom wasn't crowded, but nearly every seat behind us was filled. Mike was there. Susan. Mrs. Carter. Several veterans from the VFW. Even my old high school English teacher sat quietly in the last row. I hadn't realized how many people were standing beside me until that moment. Across the aisle sat Brian and Linda. Brian looked confident. Linda looked impatient. Their attorney stood and began first. He painted a picture of a lonely old man supposedly manipulated by his daughter into rewriting his estate. Listening to him describe my father as weak made my hands clench beneath the table. Then it was Harold's turn. He walked calmly to the podium. Your Honor, he began, this case isn't about assumptions. It's about evidence. He held up the first journal. Frank Miller's handwriting. Verified. Dated. Signed. Then another. And another. The judge spent several minutes flipping through the pages. Harold introduced the original trust documents. The notarized signatures. The property records. Every date matched. Every witness was accounted for. Then Walter took the stand. He spoke quietly. Never raising his voice. He explained exactly when Frank had entrusted him with the envelope. Exactly why he had kept it. Exactly what Frank had told him. Brian's attorney tried to shake him. Mr. Jenkins, at your age, are you certain your memory is reliable? Walter smiled. I'm 83. I forget where I leave my truck keys. But I don't forget promises I made to my best friend. A few people in the gallery smiled. Even the judge's expression softened. Then Harold presented one final exhibit. Brian's signed waiver. The very document acknowledging he had no legal claim to Frank Miller's estate. Harold handed it to the judge. The courtroom became so quiet I could hear the air conditioner humming overhead. Brian's confidence disappeared. For the first time all morning, he looked worried. And I realized this case wasn't unfolding the way he'd imagined. Brian's attorney was the first to break the silence. Your Honor, he said, clearing his throat, we would like a brief recess. The judge glanced down at the signed waiver, then back at him. You may have 10 minutes. As everyone stood, Harold leaned toward me. He didn't expect that document. I nodded slowly. No. He thought your father never planned ahead. Harold smiled. Frank Miller planned farther ahead than almost anyone I've ever met. I looked across the courtroom. Brian was pacing near the windows, running both hands through his hair. Linda stood beside him, talking quickly, but he barely seemed to hear her. For the first time since all of this began, they looked uncertain. Not scared. Just out of excuses. When court resumed, Brian's attorney tried a different approach. He argued that Frank's journals represented only one side of the story. They're personal opinions, he said. They don't prove intent. Harold stood again. I agree. The attorney looked surprised. Harold continued. That's why we also submitted bank records. He handed another folder to the bailiff. The judge reviewed several pages. So these transfers? Harold nodded. Every one of them came directly from Frank Miller's personal account. The judge turned another page. They were deposited into Mr. Dawson's account. Yes, Your Honor. Brian shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Harold wasn't finished. We also have copies of handwritten receipts. The receipts matched the journal entries almost perfectly. $3,000, $5,000, $1,200, $800, loan after loan, year after year. Each one carried Brian's signature. Each one included the same handwritten promise. I'll pay you back soon. Harold looked toward Brian. Did you? Brian stared at the table. His attorney answered instead. My client isn't on trial over personal loans. Harold nodded politely. No. But those loans establish a relationship. They show Mr. Miller repeatedly helped his son-in-law financially. He paused. Not the other way around. The point landed. The judge understood it immediately. Brian's story depended on convincing the court that Dad had been confused and manipulated. Instead, the evidence showed something entirely different. A careful man. A patient father. Someone who documented nearly everything because he wanted to protect his daughter. Linda suddenly asked if she could address the court. The judge hesitated before allowing it. She stood smoothing her jacket. My son loved Claire. I know he made mistakes. But families argue. She looked toward me. Surely we don't need to destroy each other over old misunderstandings. I almost laughed. Old misunderstandings. Being thrown out of my own home with my daughter during a thunderstorm wasn't a misunderstanding. Neither was emptying our bank account. Neither was this lawsuit. The judge looked at Linda. Ma'am, this court isn't deciding whether your family had disagreements. We're deciding whether there is any legal basis for this claim. Linda slowly sat back down. For the first time since I'd known her, she had nothing left to say. The judge reviewed his notes for several quiet minutes. Then he looked up. Having reviewed the evidence submitted today, he paused. This court finds no evidence whatsoever that Frank Miller lacked legal capacity. He turned another page. The estate planning documents are valid. The trust is valid. The waiver signed by Mr. Dawson is valid. He closed the file. Accordingly, this case is dismissed with prejudice. A quiet murmur moved through the courtroom. Dismissed with prejudice. Even I knew what that meant. Brian couldn't simply file the same claim again. The judge wasn't finished. He looked directly at Brian. Mr. Dawson? The evidence presented today suggests this lawsuit should never have been filed. I strongly encourage you to consider that before pursuing further legal action. Brian's shoulders dropped. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. Outside the courthouse, a local newspaper reporter approached me. Mrs. Dawson, would you like to comment? I looked at Brian climbing silently into his car. For a moment, I thought about everything I could say. Then I remembered something my father used to tell me. You don't have to win every argument. Sometimes living well is enough. I smiled politely at the reporter. I don't have anything to add. Then I turned toward Walter. He was waiting beside the courthouse steps with the same gentle smile he'd worn the night he handed me that dusty envelope. Without saying a word, we walked to the parking lot together. I wasn't walking perfectly. I probably never would again. But for the first time since coming home, I wasn't carrying the weight alone. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after the courthouse. Real life doesn't work that way. The roof still needed another section replaced before winter. My legs still ached whenever a cold front rolled through Kentucky. Some mornings I still reached for my phone, forgetting for a split second that there was no husband waiting for a good morning text anymore. Healing isn't a straight line. It's a collection of ordinary days that slowly become easier to carry. By the following spring, the farmhouse looked different. Fresh white paint covered the porch. The flower beds along the front walk were blooming again. Emma and I planted tomatoes, green beans, and peppers in the same garden where my father had once taught me how to pull weeds without yanking out the vegetables. Grandpa would have laughed at how crooked our rows are, Emma said one afternoon. I smiled. He absolutely would have. And then he'd quietly fix them after we went inside. She laughed. I think I would have liked him. I know you would have. Walter still stopped by almost every evening. Sometimes he brought sweet corn. Sometimes fresh biscuits his daughter baked. Sometimes he brought nothing at all. He'd simply sit on the porch with 2 glasses of iced tea while we watched the sun disappear behind the hills. Those quiet evenings became some of my favorite moments. Mike Reynolds convinced me to start restoring old furniture in Dad's barn. You've got the patience for it, he told me. I don't know the first thing about antiques. You'll learn. He was right. The first rocking chair took me nearly 3 weeks. The second took 10 days. Before long, people from Winchester, Richmond, and even Lexington were bringing me family heirlooms they wanted repaired instead of replaced. There was something deeply satisfying about giving broken things another chance. Funny enough, I finally understood that not everything broken should be restored. Furniture, yes. Trust, not always. One Saturday afternoon, Harold Benson drove out to the farm carrying another envelope. "This one's less dramatic," he joked. Inside was the final paperwork closing Brian's case. Everything was officially over. No more appeals. No more claims. No more letters from attorneys. I signed the last page, thanked Harold, and watched him drive away. I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt peaceful. That surprised me. For months, I thought revenge would feel like watching Brian lose. It didn't. The real victory came much earlier. It came the day I stopped measuring my future by what he had taken from me. Brian eventually moved out of Lexington. Through mutual friends, I heard he took a sales job in another state. I never tried to confirm where. It no longer mattered. Linda never contacted me again. I honestly hope they both found whatever they were looking for. Holding on to bitterness would have given them one last piece of my life. I wasn't willing to do that. One evening, Emma and I walked to the small family cemetery at the edge of the property. We placed fresh flowers beside my father's headstone. She slipped her hand into mine. "Mom." "Yeah." "Do you think Grandpa knew he'd still be taking care of us?" I looked at the name carved into the stone. Frank Miller, beloved husband, proud father, U.S. Army veteran. I smiled through tears. I think Grandpa believed that love doesn't stop just because someone is gone. As we walked back toward the farmhouse, I realized something I hadn't understood when this journey began. I thought my father had saved me by leaving behind a farm. He hadn't. He saved me by leaving behind the truth. That truth gave me the courage to stop begging for love from people who had already decided not to give it. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: sometimes the hardest road leads you back to the people and the values that were quietly protecting you all along. Thank you for spending this time with me. If Claire's journey reminded you of someone you love, or even of yourself, I hope you'll carry that reminder with you today. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about resilience, justice, and second chances, I'd be honored if you joined me again. The end.